I think this leads us to our next discussion, which will be a panel discussion, and it's getting complicated for me because I will have to moderate it, as our moderator had a family issue last minute. So I'm going to sit here now and invite over Anders Bettum from the Oslo Museum, Fletcher, director of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, Natalia Sielewicz, curator and head of programming at the Museum of Modern Art, and our dear friend Marina, Tsekou, education curator at the National Museum of Contemporary Art. Now, the purpose of this panel was, in fact, to see what Micah started talking about. How do you incorporate, we've been discussing about these values, these principles. We see it in the corporate world as well, of diversity, equity, inclusion. Sometimes we consider them buzzwords. We use them without meaning. What is the real way to incorporate this in your mission in a museum? I will follow the questions. I will do a combination of what I would like to ask you, but also the question that Andromachi Ghazi, a professor at the university, at the Pantheon University, who couldn't be. So her first question was common to all of you. If I asked you to point down 2 or 3 things that you think are important when discussing inclusion, diversity, and accessibility in museums, what would this be? Shall we start with you, Natalia?
Thank you for this question, and hello everyone, it's great to be here. When pondering about this question of equality and diversity, I'm immediately drawn to the question of power and political agency. I think that so much of thinking about equality within institutions has to deal with, in fact, like how much power as institutions we're willing to share and on what grounds. Because as institutions, we're also quite often wrapped around these illusions or fantasies of equality and of our saviorism. And this philosophical stance is quite important to me to kind of deconstruct and to understand it better, especially when thinking about, specifically the grounds and the political agencies of people who we are inviting to the table to speak with us. To kind of distribute and delegate the power that we are inherently embedded with as institutions. So this is one, and I think it's not just a philosophical question, because in fact, quite often in this dire political climate, we see that people who are initially granted the illusion of power from the institutions onward are they have this power quickly removed once they state opinions that might not align with political opinions of institutions. And I'm alluding, of course, to what's been happening in Germany over the past months with many artists and, in fact, cultural workers who have commented on the loss of civilian lives in Gaza. Second of all, I think we have to think about sustainability of these practices, and I'm happy to speak from personal perspective, but I'm not sure how much time we have, so I'm happy to...
We can continue once we answer this first round of questions. So yes, Annie, would you like? You have one.
Thanks so much. I can only echo so much of what you've said, and also to follow those fantastic presentations by Esme and Mika, that indeed you can't program your way temporarily out of inequality. And I think that's an illusion we might have had in the 2000s, that as long as we created a kind of a visibility for certain other either minoritized positions or precarious positions, that somehow was our job done. And I think what Mika showed so kind of importantly, and what Natalia is talking about is the real structural change that needs to happen, the real sustainable change that actually needs to happen within museums, which is exciting. I mean, it's absolutely exciting to understand that the power can be shared. It's exciting to be challenged from what we are finding are often outmoded institutions anyway. I was once told, and I wish I could remember who said it to me, but that museums are like zombies. You just can't kill them. And in a way, that's great, you know, so why are we afraid to change them? I mean, if they have this massive visibility and this kind of civic understanding or public understanding, then we've got an incredible tool in our hands. So we need to be a lot more courageous, I think, about how we rethink, we restructure, and engage with these extraordinary zombies, really. The other thing I think that's really important is to embrace that idea of listening and dare to be less authoritative, again, which speaks to the idea of power. I was just thinking about Adrian Piper, who I can remember, who said, you know, she thought museums, she was in loyal opposition to the MoMA. That's how she described her relationship. And I think that's fantastic. Thoroughly engaged, but perhaps opposing or disagreeing. And we're only resonant if we are able to debate and to engage and to be corrected also. So I think the courage to be much more speculative, the courage to change, and the courage to actually engage and think coalitions and solidarities is incredibly important.
And make them sustainable as well, as Natalia was saying, so be able to continue and not just have them as a one-off engagement. I think this is also
absolutely fundamental. And again, one could break that down into all kinds of things, like restructuring finances, like even understanding that perhaps the modes of operations of museums don't necessarily work for precarious communities or others, or indeed antagonistic political communities, or whatever the political sort of majority says at a moment. So one needs to really think about how to as much curate the institution as ever just curate a program. I think that's the vital work we need to do now.
Yeah, a lot to say in that. Anders, please, your first response.
Thank you. I work for a small museum in Oslo, and we do a lot of co-curation with source communities. And I often advise museums who are not so much into this work yet, but who would like to get access and start working along these lines. I'd like to remind them that institutional barriers can also be an obstacle. We work with the communities of youth in our neighborhood. It's like a local museum. I try to reach out and get in touch with these communities of kids, and we find that, you know, our institutional ways of communicating are failing us. You cannot send out emails, you cannot invite people for meetings. You're basically trying to reach people in their private lives from an institutional starting point. And that also has to, it's related to the question of power. We are coming from a certain place, we are communicating in a certain way, and that's, if you insist on using your way, you won't get anywhere. So it's constantly, you need to moderate your way of talking to people. You may have to stop sending emails and start using social platforms that you're not used to manage. You may have to work outside of work hours, and you may have to accept conduct that you're not normally seeing in the office space. So it's yeah, it's something about the way you approach people, and the communication is going to be very different.
And I would suppose that this would take much more time to build this relationship and build the trust, and also even train. I mean, let the people, the communities know that you are there to share, to collaborate, and to exchange ideas on your programming, for example. Yes, thank you. Marina, you don't work in a small institution in Oslo.
No, but in a complicated one. If you think that we have changed buildings, directors, and different phases in the history of our, let's say, 2 decades of the operation of this museum. So one thing that I could point out is that in time of overlapping crises, different crises, the last 2 decades, it is better for us to put everything into question and take nothing for granted. So we can put into questions our methods we follow, if they are still valid today, to ask ourselves if the groups we address must be the same always, or must revisit the groups we address and we call to come with us, and also practices and policies of inclusion is something that must concern every department of the museum, and it is not the responsibility of one, just the department, but it is a collective effort. And also it should align with the mission and the goals and the vision of the whole museum. So cooperation, collaboration between the departments of the museum is something very useful if we want to be effective and foster the dialogue, the active listening, and the representation of many different voices.
The question that comes into my mind, and again, anyone can answer, is this, okay, one thing we're trying to see, and what Micah was saying, and what Esme was saying as well, this idea of sharing power, of giving authorship to the communities, for example, that we wish to share. But I would like to know, because you're in different positions in your museum, what happens in the inside power and the challenges and the resistance you get within your institution in trying to effect change, to make something groundbreaking. I mean, the idea of changing the name of a museum, it's a huge success in my eyes for an institution to do it collectively. Would it happen if the person on top, for example, wasn't the person who is there? Is it a collective decision at the end of the day, or is it something that's imposed?
I think
And you're in different positions, because, for example, you're leadership-wise, for example, you're a director of your museum, for example, and so please, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does depend on the part of the leadership, and,
Yes.
and it does depend on the tendency of how people manage institutions or understand them. I mean, I can give a very good example of sometimes it's in a moment of crisis that allows you to kind of really change things. And for us, in the middle of COVID, our museum was totally shut down and taken over by the government because it was understood to be, since the establishment of the Irish state, a site for pandemic, pestilence and war. And it was the place in which dead bodies should be managed. So a massive mortuary was set up, and we'd all, fresh with the images of COVID, seen the, refrigerated vans in Italy and in New York, and I remember just thinking, my God, if this is what we become remembered for, I mean, this is not what I signed up for in a way. But it was really interesting because it forced me to start to think, I think like Esme said about, the time of the Second World War, what is your civic institution? Who's it for? And maybe ours was to house the dead with dignity at that moment. Maybe that was a really important thing that we were proud to do. And so I think when you really start to test why those commitments and those passions are in your institution and really understand how they might resonate and truly be a civic service without intense saviorism. I think you often can bring people on board, and I think it's about being able to have those very difficult conversations. Because I think if you're rudderless or leaderless, I mean even collectively, or without a North Star or a direction, then the effect is rather pointless. It becomes more irrelevant anyway. So I think it's sometimes that testing of what it means to be to have that heritage of the museum, to have the sort of educational and edificational sort of processes of modernism tested within the 21st century is an exciting thing to do. And most people are there because they're passionate. Sometimes I joke that the museum runs on emotional fumes, lots of passion. So how do you think that passion together? And I think it's really a question of communicating and listening, but definitely leading, yeah.
You want to say something?
Yes, I definitely agree with Annie, but also I think it's super healthy for institutions to retain some kind of autonomy or autonomous cells within their structures. I'll give you an example. That was a huge lesson for us as a museum with the onset of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So in the very first days of invasion, quite spontaneously, people started gathering at our premises. Those were people who don't necessarily work at the museum, but are, frequently there and act as educators, cultural agents, and together with 3 employees, full-time employees, basically started a solidarity center. It started off with a very simple act of making sandwiches for thousands of refugees who were arriving at the train station with collecting of medicine. And sooner rather than later, it became very clear to us at the institution that this place cannot be like a one-off, support structure. It has to be housed within the premises, even though this is like another thing. When I'm mentioning saviorism and these fantasies of mutual aid, as an institution, you might quite quickly understand that not everyone within your institution is happy to host people or to smell butter and cheese and be kindly reminded that the war is happening just 400 kilometers away from Warsaw. But anyway, this place became like this a very autonomous cell within the museum structure, and now it is running mostly a program for diaspora. But a beautiful thing about solidarity is that very quickly it becomes contagious. So quite often, when you start with one initiative, you think, and I'm speaking precisely about our Ukrainian community who co-run this initiative, you start organizing events that don't specifically relate to your identity politics, but you go beyond that. And I think this is really important as well. How do you build coalitions? And this led us to events that were dedicated to really, parallel initiatives, even during these first weeks of war, where we also organized, legal workshops for non-Ukrainian refugees who are also arriving to Poland, or kids workshops, things like that, and speaking about different forms of colonialism. So autonomy for me it's something that I would really love to retain in our museums, even though we are going through this very big, transparent restructuring of different departments. I have this dream that perhaps we could have this slightly disobedient cell in the whole organism to disrupt things. I think it's very important to be open for disruptions and disobediences. Even though as institutional workers we know how institutions react to disruptions, it's not always as optimistic as it might sound.
So I guess it's a combination of creating the disruption, creating the change by daring something, and then incorporating in both the logic of the institution, but maybe, and I really think this works in the governance itself, what Esme was saying, that they're looking for a director of social justice. It changes things once you establish the position within the institution, because then you make a statement inside as well to your co-workers, to your colleagues, that this is important for the museum, and outside. Anders, building trust again. I'm going down to communities. I'm combining with questions that Andromachi had for you. This maintaining trust. This is actually what I was thinking of asking you as well. Can you give us some examples based on your experience on how you maintain trust and you create a continuity when you develop diversity programs?
Yes, we like I said, we try to reach out to community groups and cooperate with them, establish collaboration projects. And one thing we've learned is that you can't just start inviting people to make an exhibition. You have to, we launched these, we call them documentation and research projects, pilot projects in advance. They can take from 1 year to up to 3 years. And the example I'm thinking of was a project that we did a couple of years ago with the Romani population in Oslo. And it's a very small and marginalized minority group in Norway, one of our national minority groups. And its relationship to the state has been problematic for a very long time and for very good reasons. But you know, the past decade or so, I think the state has changed its tactics a little bit and starting a soft power approach, you can say, to these groups involving museums. And we started a project with the groups in the Oslo region. And it took us 3 years to establish contact and trust enough to get started on the actual exhibition work. Thankfully, the mandate from the state was liberal. They said that start this process, see what happens. We're not demanding an exhibition. It's okay, just start doing something. So that was a great starting point for us, and we could actually take the time it took and the time we needed to establish contact and to establish that trust that is required. In this example, it took 3 years until we could start working. But in the end, we succeeded, and it was a splendid exhibition. And it led to a lot of things following the exhibit. There was a reconciliation process that started, I think, not just from what we did, but also the other museums contributed. And this culminated with an official pardoning on the state, behalf of the state. The Prime Minister gave an official pardon to the Roma communities in Norway. And there was a compensation also that was promised. And that took form a few years later as a culture house, a state-funded culture house. And we were able actually to give our exhibition as a housewarming gift, you can say, to the new culture house. So now our exhibition has gained a new life in the Romani culture house in Oslo. And we are continuing the dialogue and communication with this group. So this is a nice example.
This is a success story of organically building something and also making sure it's sustainable, basically, with respect also to visibility and giving voice. So the process and the establishment of this program is important.
Not all our projects have been that successful.
I'm sure. I can ask you all about what hasn't worked, and this will be another panel discussion. Marina, you are the curator of education in the National Contemporary Museum, that we all know in Greece for sure is very active in trying to create programs for what are called underserved communities. Reflecting on social relevance, what's the process? How do you pick the groups you will focus on, and what's the process of creating and shaping the programs together with the different groups?
Thanks for the question. It is a process that is going both ways. I mean, it is a process based on demand and offer. We take, of course, into account the issues that contemporaneity and curacy is faced. And we also take account the demand from the different groups that they come to us and ask for collaboration. One step that we take is to communicate with different institutions, NGOs, and etc. that care for people who are in need, and ask them to collaborate with us and co-create programs for the people. And this is a way to design programs that are meaningful for them. I mean, in collaboration with people, professionals from other institutions and us. Fortunately, we have already built some long-lasting collaborations, such as with the units for drug addicts, which is a long-lasting collaboration since the beginning, I can say, from the operation of the National Museum of Contemporary Art. And it is a collaboration that evolves year by year. And we've learned a lot by this collaboration. For example, doing every year programs with this group of people, we realized that if we address only to these people and do programs with them, in some way we perpetuate the marginalization and the categorization and the stigma. So we decided to open this program, and for the first time we asked a photography group from the 18 Nano unit for drug addicts to collaborate with another group of photography students. And that worked very well. The interplay within the two groups was amazing. We learned from them, and the two groups learned from each other. And from that time on, we continued to make programs for mixed groups. For example, when the crisis, the migration, the refugee crisis came in Greece, we decided to do programs for refugees, but not separate them from the whole Greek society, but to put, let's say, for example, unaccompanied minors with school groups together and do things together, Greek students with unaccompanied minors. Or the recent collaboration with the Goethe Institute, a project called Across Generations, in the framework of which we did for the first time programs for students and teachers to work together equally, students and teachers, and that was a very useful and very productive time for students and teachers as well. They get to know each other very well through the creative and artistic activities.
This leads me to another question I have, especially the three of you who work in contemporary art museums. How much do you involve artists in creating projects, especially when you're trying to have inclusive, to design inclusive projects? If you can give us some examples.
I'm working with an artist right now. I mean, I do, but I actually think that the museum sometimes has instrumentalized artists in solving the problems when the structures, you know, are the things that need to be changed. So on one level, I think absolutely artists are often driving on not only the creative practice, but sometimes it makes me a bit nervous when artists are pushed front and center and the museums stand well back. So I think there's an important balance there. But at the moment, I'm working with a really wonderful artist called Seamus Nolan, who's specifically representing and working with the Irish indigenous Romani population. They're called Pavi or Minker. And he was talking about the idea that museums can be really extractive. You know, again, you're kind of coming in and you're talking and sort of wanting to understand about cultural expression or even have people's time and labor when they maybe don't have that time and labor unless it's properly paid, etc. And so he's been really helping us think about how we might change the structures and also the structures of collecting and even the taxonomies of how we itemize our archives and change perhaps the quite violent structures we have that separate things and become much more flexible and understanding of the fact that majority cultures are the way in which museums operate and that they might need other structural change. So I think, yeah, artists and other thinkers, other disciplines are always vital to bring into the situation. And absolutely, I would say in terms of just gender balance, and I'm definitely really pushing as hard as I can to try and make sure that we think very much about more women, more wisdom, more plurality within our museum all the time, and that of course includes artists.
And that's also something that can be demonstrated both within and in the programming, so both with respect to who you work with but also with respect to what you present to the wider public. And this is always something important to start with. Natalia, do you want to say?
Sure, maybe I'll just mention that during the last 8-year rule of the right wing in Poland, the art scene underwent a radical transformation. So after these glorious 2000s, which we mentioned before, the illusion of stability, suddenly, you know, like we had to renegotiate public space. And it's quite interesting and important how museums can play this role, especially when the right wing start dismantling other institutions. This was our case. And artists themselves were immediately drawn to the street, to activism that was happening during marches and demonstrations. And that also gave rise to new art forms, I would say, that are not necessarily easily, or I'd say not easily, but they're not necessarily supported by the gallery system. So that's the question for us as institutions: how hospitable can we be, how instrumental we can be towards those practices. And I think that echoes what Annie was saying, that institutions actually are very, very happy to push artists to the front and then, you know, use this affective labor, this creativity. So I would say that for me, as a museum worker, it has always been very important to politicize the infrastructure within which I work and to share this infrastructure with others on the basis of partnership rather than help. So something that's one-sided, that's relational, just in one direction. And I think if you want to be an institution that responds to different crises, you have to be close to your art scene. Because, not because the art scene will support you, but because you can be more effective as a civic society.
And you learn a lot. You understand a lot of what's going on out there. Marina, would you like to say something?
The last years we are fortunate enough to collaborate with contemporary artists and commission some projects which they collectively create with communities and people outside the museum. But this is just the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years in the museum, because during the first years we didn't have any budget for this kind of activities. We only had exhibitions, and the Department of Education followed the exhibitions and designed programs for different groups, school groups mainly, but also with different groups. It is very essential to collaborate with artists and do community programs with them. They have the creativity, the ideas, and the correct methods to involve communities, different communities, and give them the opportunity to have the experience of the artistic experience. We don't have this kind of knowledge. And
Yes, please, Anders.
Yeah, I'd like to comment. We also do quite a bit of art exhibitions, and we like to think of our collaboration with artists as a way of handing over power, because that's a very typical exhibition type where you give away a lot of power about over the contents. I mean, usually the artist is largely responsible for contents, but it's an interesting spin on it to say that you push the artist in front of you to take the brunt of all critiques and everything that can come in. So it's a fun dichotomy in this power transaction. Are you giving away power? Are you sharing your power, or are you just using the artist as a shield? I just found that an interesting way of looking at it. Thank you.
And to what length do you share, Marta? I mean, collaborating, for example, with artists, for me, it's also as mediators. So it's and artists, not just artists, for example. So a number of different people, like Sarah was telling us in the morning about how they design together with neuroscientists, with different types of cognitive understandings, to say generally. So this is something interesting also when you try to be truly inclusive. I have one last question that all of you could answer by Andromache this time, and it's straightforward in the sense that what would you think is the most important advice to art museums that are now embarking on diversity and inclusion programs to give? So one advice for somebody who's just starting now.
Well, one thing I would say, and again, I keep going back to the glorious 2000s as a kind of joke, importing a kind of one-size-fits-all idea of diversity or inclusion is absolutely not the thing to do. So I suppose that's the first thing, and that might seem obvious now, but I think that's what a lot of Europe did within in that earlier period. I think it's working on understanding and critiquing one's own majority, and understanding one's own precise locatedness, but also dialoguing, not thinking only in relation to one's own exceptionalism. So it's really trying to kind of be precisely located where you are, understanding the power of that situation, and then always be willing to kind of dialogue globally and understand other examples and just listen. Yeah.
Any other advice?
I think that as an institution, we're always starting, you know. So I think, at least like from my perspective, I would say that we are still in the process of learning. One thing that worked well for us, I think, is also employing people from, let's say, like different underprivileged group on fixed term basis, you know, in different departments, not necessarily just education, or not to undermine these important departments, but to kind of go across different departments and to invest in education. I think this is like one of the pillars of our museum, and that it will become one of the most important pillars of our museum in the future. Yeah, exactly. Just so you can see the world through the eyes of people who are part of your team, in moments that are not always work-related, but also like social moments and these, you know, like friendly moments when you're sharing lunch with someone and you are able to adopt someone else's worldview. I think that's really important. And definitely critiquing our own majority. I really do believe in that, because I think one thing that we also discussed behind the scene is the importance of class, like how frequently we forget about class as an important marker of inclusivity, and that's also something I'm interested in. Still curious, like how to actually activate inclusivity on the class basis, even when you have free access to an institution or very cheap tickets. So that's something I would be very curious to hear from other professionals, how you guys are dealing with it.
Thank you. Anders?
Yeah, well, I will go back to where I started by saying that you have to communicate with people, you know, at the level where they're at, and using that kind of voice. I have an example from a project we launched a couple of years ago. We were trying to recruit people from the neighborhood, especially young people, to work with the Future project. And we sent out, not thinking clearly, because as an institution, we don't really learn from our mistakes. Like you said, we always start all over again. So I did the same mistake that I've done before. I sent out emails to my contacts around the city, saying to these organizations, do you have any kids this appropriate age who would like to join us for a future project? Send them to this information or orientation meeting on this and this date. And we were shocked to see that only 5 people showed up for that meeting. So we tried to have another meeting the next week where only 1 person showed up. And on the way out, it started dawning on me, you know. And I asked the receptionist who was on duty that night, who happened to be in the target group, I said, so we have this interesting project. It's about the future. We're going to imagine futures in the neighborhood. Would that be something you would find interesting? And she's like, oh, sure, that's great. When can I start? And can I bring 3 friends? So, you know, I got more people attending my workshops from just asking the receptionist than I got from my orientation meetings, 2 orientation meetings. So it's
Yeah.
just, again, talk to people.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
exactly. We make it simple sometimes. Marina.
I would use another verb, listen. Listen to the society, to the needs of the people, and to give space, time for communication, expression, and represent different voices. That's my advice.
And if I can add from my experience also as a curator, it's also a matter of committing. It needs time, it needs commitment. We were saying that before, sometimes it's easier to do things on your own. Once you decide to share and to co-design, you have to mean it, and you have to understand it first yourself, and also make a point about it. So more time and more commitment.
And I think people understand if you're authentic. People
Exactly.
can smell out,
Yeah.
you know, the fact that somebody's not authentic straight away.
Otherwise, we go back to ticking the box and the buzzwords that often happen in this case. I don't know. Oh, we have 19 seconds, I see. Do we have one question by Caroline? Somebody give her the mic.
I don't think it's working.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I wanted to ask if there's anything that you've put in place to monitor and evaluate how you're doing. So you've made these commitments to diversity, and how do you measure how you're doing? And I asked that from an experience I had last year when I was in charge of San Francisco Heritage. We had a museum and a cultural center. We issued a diversity report card, but it was self-done. We opened it up for other people to comment on, to kind of evaluate, but it was really challenging to think we had a diversity commitment, but I'm wondering, how would you measure, how do you know how you're doing in that?
It's a very good question. Who wants to start?
We do metric analysis, but I think you can simply see it. You know it. You can feel the change in your institution. But I mean, I think it's very important, as we said earlier, to allow for proper processes of evaluation and other experts into, be your loyal opposition and check whether you're doing what you think you're doing.
Sorry, Marina?
Sorry, yes.
Marina, go ahead.
In our museum up to now, we have, let's say, only qualitative criteria, and we just observe if organizations want to collaborate with us next year and again, and if new organizations come to us and ask for collaboration. This is one criteria or two. And another one is just to observe the, how people say goodbye to you when the project finished. You can understand if they are content, if they feel that something meaningful have done, and if you see them again in your museum. This is another criteria up to now.
Anders?
Yeah, I think this is a crucial issue, and I mean, you have surveys, you can get some numbers, people attending and whatnot, but it doesn't really tell you if you made the impact that you wanted to make. And for us, when we collaborate with a group, with a particular group, you know from the relationship with that group if you succeeded or not. You can tell on the opening, have you reached that community? So you can tell with your partner, have you succeeded or not? But what's the impact with the greater audience? And this is something I'm always begging my friends in museology to develop methods to measure this and to do studies on how we're doing. So.
Thank you. And Natalia?
We do internal evaluations of our projects, but in terms of this inside-outside evaluation, I really enjoyed the example that Sarah offered in Dallas Museum, when you have an external evaluator, someone who, observes you and does it, at least I hope, in a very compassionate way, and writes a report that isn't necessarily based on a chart and table, because I think as museum workers, I can at least speak for myself, we are very tired. Like this sort of process of filling out forms can almost take you away from the job that you have to do, like with the energy. It's extremely important, and we do a lot of it at our museum. But I think maybe, yeah, like inviting a PhD scholar or a social worker or an artist to evaluate 6 months of education activity or one particular project could be a very interesting lesson. Or reception staff, you know. So we do these questionnaires, of course, but yeah.
Another quite live way of looking at it, especially for a collecting institution, is how your collection changes. Because that's really a living kind of marker of what you are creating for, in our case, the National Archive.
Thank you. It would be helpful to have a pattern of monitoring and evaluation, though, now that I think about it, because we're all talking about experiencing the results rather than having found a way to register and share without that being a typical numerical, for example, survey of who attended and when and what. So it's very interesting. It's also like measuring the social impact. It's this issue of quality versus quantity, which is much more complicated to grasp. But we should find a way to grasp it, because this is what brings the funds.
But also convincing our municipalities or federal state that not every activity is quantifiable in these measures or KPIs that are simply numbers, but that social impact, as you just said, is based on something intangible quite often, or these human relations. But how do we, where do we find these measures, and how do we teach our partners who offer us funds that that's why culture matters, you know?
Thank you. So I think we have 0:00. I think we have to stop midnight. Thank you very much to our panel. Thank you. Thank you very much for this.